Alrighty, seems like we're live. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Sunday morning, and welcome to our series on the Book of Exodus. Now, this is a very interesting little series, and I'm finding it so much fun to work through it. I've worked through it quite a long time ago, probably about 2 or 3 years ago, and after deciding to turn it into a couple of sessions here on YouTube, I'm just surprised by how much I learn again. Things I've already read, rereading them, and finding context for them, and it just seems to like build up understanding. So I'm hoping that also this little series will do the same for many of you who don't maybe have time to delve into scholarship, to have time to read books that specialize in some of these areas, as it has done also for me. So today we're moving on to session 2, part 2 of Exodus through ancient eyes. And in our first series, we took a little bit of time to just discuss the origin of the book of Exodus, in a similar way than what we did with Genesis. And you could always pop back and have a look at our Genesis series. It's an 8-part series on the book of Genesis, where we do things that are very similar to what we're doing here. All right, so the book of Exodus. Last week, just to do a very, very brief recap, uh, I just want to mention some of the conclusions that certain scholars and most of the mainstream scholars have kind of come to when it comes to the book of Exodus. It doesn't seem to be such a straightforward story after all. Um, when we start to take into account linguistics, archaeology, the literary patterns that we find within the book itself, the anachronisms in the book, um, just tell us that we might have misunderstood in Exodus to some degree, especially with regards to authorship, the time in which it was authored. And hopefully, this little series will also awaken you or make you aware of the very, very strong literary devices that are found within the book of Exodus. So, we spoke a little bit about that last week. I just want to do a very short recap of what we said. Now, the first thing is we came to the conclusion that most scholars locate Exodus or the Exodus around the middle of the 13th century BCE. Although, when we find or follow the Bible's literal timeline, it should be sitting at around 1500 BCE. Now, the reason why most scholars prefer the little bit of a later date is number one, due to the fact that many times the Bible would use numbers not in a literal fashion, but in a literary fashion, in other words, in a figurative fashion. So it's hard to just go on those numbers. Secondly, the archaeology. When it comes to Israel, the first mention of them in the land of Canaan, number one, plus very limited evidence there is for destruction of cities that were supposed to have happened when Israel flooded Canaan and started started with Jericho and started taking in cities and destroying cities. All of that evidence point to a much, much later time, which places us more or less in the middle of the 13th century BCE. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that linguists have identified the evolution of they're quite familiar with the evolution of the Hebrew language in the forms that it was written down. And so it's very possible for them, when they have a piece of Hebrew in front of them, to come to conclusion around when this was actually written. And so according to that, linguists place the writing of the book of Exodus in the same way that we would probably place the book of Genesis and the rest of the Pentateuch from the 7th century BCE onwards. Now, that's quite a long time. If we assume that the Exodus did take place in the 13th century, we're talking about 600 to 700 years later. That is a very, very long time. And the assumption then becomes that these stories were only written down and shaped in the form that we have them today in the 6th or 7th or 6th century BCE. Now, that's a very long time for stories to be shaped, for stories to take shape, to become embellished, and so forth. Okay, so this is one of the primary reasons why scholars believe that the book of Exodus could not have been written by Moses because of the type of Hebrew that is used in the book. Now, we can debate whether Moses could read or write. Being raised in Pharaoh's court, there'd probably be, as a prince, good chance that he could have possibly written to some degree in Egyptian, for that matter. But the Hebrew in which the Bible, or specifically Exodus, is written is from a time much, much later. So it's basically conclusive for most scholars that Moses did definitely not write this book. He is a character in the book, as the book itself suggests. And it's written in a time long, long after Moses, where, for instance, the name of the Pharaoh can't be remembered anymore, or even the grave of Moses. Nobody knows where this grave is actually located. So, rather, scholars have come to the conclusion, this is after much information and the clues that are in the books are taken together, that the book is finally edited by scribes in around the 7th to 6th, and some say even little bit later century BCE, and that it consists of many traditions, like various traditions, um, on specific matters, and that it was redacted and brought together by these scribes at a later stage. As we go through the book of Exodus, in the same way that we saw in Genesis, we'll find several places where multiple traditions speak on the same issue. Um, and we will talk about that in detail, about those occurrences in the book of Exodus. But the point is just that most scholars today believe that the book of Exodus is written by multiple authors and redacted and brought together, edited in and around the 7th, 6th, or a little bit later century BCE. Okay, now we asked questions of historicity last time, because this is the most important question normally for most Christians: is, did all of this actually happen? If you speak to a little kid, if you talk about a 11th or 11-year-old, 12-year-old about Exodus, that's the first question that comes, especially before everyone has told them that everything happened literally exactly like that as it is written. If you introduce it to someone who's never read it before, that's the first question: is, did all of this really happen? So we had a look, and it seems like there is no direct evidence that we have outside the Bible for the presence of Israel within Egypt as slaves and an exodus as described in the Bible. But we do, however, have some indirect evidence that leads us to believe that this story has some historical roots. There is a memory of these historical roots within the people of Israel, but that much of it has been dressed in the language of a much larger reality, a cosmic theological reality, and a lot of it is pointing us back to the creation story of Genesis 1, and also the Noah flood account that we find a little bit later in Genesis. Okay, so we do have a historical root, and then the question becomes, how large is the historical root and how large is the embellishment? Like, what percentage of this is historical and what percentage of this is embellished over centuries of retelling, reinterpreting, by each generation in their own context for their own purposes. Right, so today we're going to move on to a very simple session, and the session is just going to give us basically a very quick overview of the entire book, having a look at the major thematic presence. In other words, the main themes that occur throughout the book, that it seems like the writer of the book keeps coming back to these major themes. There's 5 of them we're going to be mentioning today. And then lastly, we want to start the story of Exodus, and we want to talk very briefly about the women, the heroes. There were 5 women. Some of them were named and some of them weren't named, but they were responsible to save the life of Moses in the face of a direct command by Pharaoh to inhibit the further population growth of the Israelites. So that's what we're going to be doing today. And then at the end, I'm going to be talking about next week's session. So I just want to mention it briefly that next week's session is probably the most interesting of all the ones I've encountered up until now. And we're going to be dealing with the actual birth of Moses and having a look at its literary function. It just so happens that this is not the first time that a very important leader that kind of liberates his people or fights an evil king is born through this process of being dumped in the river in a basket, and is rescued by a water drawer. So we're going to have a look at that and just see how the Israelites might have used that thematic approach or that literary trope um, to tell us more about how important Moses really was to them. All of that said, let's go into the book of Moses and do a very quick overview. We're dealing with about 40 chapters. It's a rather lengthy book, but we can more or less divide it into two sections. The first 15 chapters deals with what happens inside of Egypt. And then we move on to chapter 16 to chapter 40. And that is concerning what happens after they leave. Now, a very large portion of what happens after they leave happens at this holy mountain, Mount Sinai. And we're going to be saying a lot about it. Sometimes it's mentioned as or named Horeb. Um, this very elusive place that we find very hard to locate. Um, they spend most of their time there. In fact, 21 of the chapters of Exodus and the first 10 chapters of Numeri is around Mount Sinai. Now, that's absolutely no surprise to us because although the actual Exodus is a very important part of the history of Israel, just as important, or you could say probably more important, is the encounter with God through their Moses at this holy mountain, where they get the instructions, the law, for how they are to approach life, how they should govern themselves. And all of this is in preparation for an ancient promise that was made to Abraham, land and a nation. And so before they can enter the promised land, Canaan, they have to get this law. And in order to get this law, they got to get to the mountain. And in order to get to the mountain, God has to, deal with Pharaoh and Egyptian slavery. All right. So we could further break each one of these two parts down into part one, chapters 1 to 15, could be broken down into a prelude, chapters 1 to 6, then the plagues, chapters 7 to 13, and then the actual departure from Egypt, two chapters 14 and 15. The second portion, the portion basically centering at Mount Sinai, could be broken up also into three portions. Chapter 16 to 19 is their journey to and their arrival at this holy mountain. Then from verse chapter 20 to 24, we have the giving of the laws, which is incredibly important and becomes a major theme right throughout the rest of the Bible into the New Testament, and something that then becomes a highly debated topic within the very early church. You will recall Paul being a strong proponent of a different way of possibly dealing with the law, but this law absolutely centers the entire nation around the covenant of God. And then lastly, chapters 25 to 40 is the idea of a tabernacle. And this is the first time that we see this, well, at least in its literal form, because there are other literary appearances of the tabernacle that we will speak about a little bit later. Right, so let's turn our attention to the major themes in the book of Exodus. This is kind of like a literary viewpoint of this book. We want to look at the themes that we find without the book that the writer seems to value. So this is not the themes we value. These are the themes that the writer seems to value and that he seems to come back to from time to time in the book, sometimes in a literal form, sometimes it's in a literary form. Things that keep on emerging and coming up over and over and over again. So let's have a look at them. Some of the very big theological ideas in Exodus that the author seems to come or keep coming back to, they also help us to understand what's important to the author and get our heads around the overall message of the book. So the very first one is this idea that Yahweh, I'm going to use the word Yahweh, this is Yod He Vah He, the Tetragrammaton, we find in the Hebrew Bible, big idea worthy of Israel's worship. Right, so this is huge. It's a massive theme in this book. It's part of why they're getting delivered. It's part of why they get the law. It's part of why they'll get the promised land. That Israel is not allowed to direct their worship to any other God. Right. So in Exodus, Yahweh performs this great deliverance. He pulls them, now we know the story, of course, but he pulls them out of Egypt with his mighty wonders. Um, and as we mentioned last week, it doesn't seem like Yahweh from the book of Exodus has a problem with slavery as such, because it gets reinstituted within the law and within the laws that govern the Israelites. The Israelites, of course, take slaves again for themselves under command, I'd have you know, of the peoples that they conquer. So it wasn't so much or primarily that Yahweh, and when I say Yahweh, what I mean, let me just add this little portion here. It is the perspective of the ancient Jewish writers, or say Israeli writers, Israelite writers, on who Yahweh was. So whenever we talk about Yahweh in this portion, we're talking about the perspective of the people who wrote the text. That does not necessarily mean that you agree with that, or that I, or that anybody else agrees with it. We don't really at this point care what I think and what you think about Yahweh. We are talking about this book and how they thought about him. So from that perspective, it doesn't look like Yahweh was very interested in abolishing slavery, but it was really more about this idea that he made a promise to Abraham. And that part of that promise, we'll talk about that a little bit later again, was that these people would end up in slavery, and that he would come, he would remember them, and he would come and deliver them from basically the world's superpower. It's huge. They're a very small nation. They were 70 people when they entered Egypt. They ended up being a oppressed, probably a minority in Egypt. They were breeding like rabbits, and that was a problem. But the point is that um, because God remembers and comes and delivers them, he then, it seems like he expects them to be his, and that they would worship him and him alone because of how he brought them out from Egypt. Now, a while ago, we did a little session on Deuteronomy, maybe a year or two ago already. And there it's also quite clear in the Deuteronomy, the giving of the second law, as it's directly translated, and that when the writer of Deuteronomy writes for the people, he makes it pretty clear that they need to follow Yahweh because he's brought them out of Egypt. And if they don't, they'll end up back in some form of slavery and worse. So there's a lot of pressure here on the Israelites to worship him and him alone. Now, you might think as a modern Christian, or just as a modern monotheist possibly, why would this even be an important instruction? Because there are no other gods. Like, if the average Christian today has no qualms about the idea that there's only one God. Well, this is something that I had to realize slowly, that I can't project my views back onto an ancient Israeli view, and that the reality is, and we'll have a look at this numerous times throughout this series, that Israelites of this time, if let's place them back in the mid 13th century BCE, were thoroughly polytheistic and at best monolatrous, which means that they believed in the existence of many gods. We know this because the scriptures themselves testify to this reality, and constantly asking them not to sacrifice to these gods or to follow these gods, but acknowledges the presence or the almost existence of these gods. This was their reality. Just to come back to the definition of them being monolatrous, it would mean that they believed in the existence of many gods, but they worshipped one. Right, and that's different from monotheism, which is a strict belief that there's really only one God. And most monotheists today, if someone would worship anything else, they would put that in the classification of demon or evil spirit. But back then, it wasn't like that. Demon and evil spirits not really much of a reality in First Temple Judaism. There is the reality of many gods, and for Israel, God was the high God, or what we commonly refer to as the most high, right? And for most of us today, we're like, yes, of course, he's the highest, but the question is, highest of what? And it is most probable that this term meant the highest of all the gods. There's much evidence in the Psalms, and some of the other books of the Bible, that God is amongst gods, the sons of God. The sons of God are a term that are used for the family of gods, of which God would have been the head. And for the Israelites, Yahweh became that head of everything, the king of the gods, the most high God. All right, so I hope that's not too much of a surprise to most of you, but it's just the reality that we need to face. And although many modern Christians don't like to think of Israel or um, any of the ancient Israelites as people who believed in other gods, I think the evidence is overwhelming that this was in fact the case. So this is why it was such a struggle for them to only worship Yahweh, because there was so many other choices. And that's where their struggle always started. But it seems like the writer of Exodus is making it clear that Yahweh alone, he expects to be worshipped alone by Israel. And the reason for that is he is the one that delivered them out from the Egyptian superpower and brought them out into freedom. And the basic narrative of the Old Testament is, follow me and I'll give you your land and your nation. Disobey me and I will annihilate you. Okay, so we can have a look at this idea of the delivery from Egypt as the main reason why the Israelites had to exclusively worship Yahweh. I'm going to mention some verses that you can refer to if you like: Psalm 77, 11 to 20, Psalm 78, 52, and Psalm 107, 28 to 32. So the principle is summarized then, of course, in the first commandment of the 10 commandments, or the Decalogue, that they receive on the holy mountain later on. It goes like this, I quote, I am Yahweh, your God, right? Who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Therefore, you shall have no other gods before me. This comes from Exodus 20, verse 2 to 3, a little bit later on. But I want to draw your attention just to that final little part of this, saying, therefore, you will have no other gods before me. Now, most of us obviously just assume that, because we assume Moses writing down God's words. God can't mean that there are other gods, because obviously God knows there are no other gods, and therefore he can't mean that. The reality is this is written down by people at a much later time, and that their reality was other gods. And that's why this, when you read it in its simplest form, you will have no other gods before me, means there are other gods, or it presupposes the existence of other gods, but tells you not to choose them, basically. So basically, no other God has a claim on the Israeli people, because God, Yahweh, he delivered them, and he has promised them something. Now he's come to deliver them, and now, therefore, they have to worship him alone. That's the first big thematic idea that we find in Exodus, explicitly stated, and becomes a huge tension point for the rest of the Old Testament. Eventually, technically speaking, the Israelites get exiled into Babylonian exile for this very reason. They were unable to follow this very first command. They were constantly in idolatry, constantly caught in a form of polytheism. Um, not even just monolatrous worship, but like literally polytheism. That we, for instance, can see by the actions of the wisest man who ever lived, according to these people, which was Solomon. Which, if you strip Solomon down and just read plainly what he did, he was basically a polytheist. I mean, he erected statues for other gods, like any other multiplicity of gods. It's a bit fried. It's a bit. That's exactly what actually happened. So the point is that this thematic expression of worship of Yahweh alone becomes a huge contention point in Israel. And from an archaeological point of view, and most scholars agree that most of First Temple Judaism, which means up until the exile, most of the average person, that the scriptures we have of the prophets writing against polytheism was an elite group or a small group that were warning the people. And the fact that they had to keep on warning them just simply means that this is what the people were actually up to most of this time. That being said, the strongest monotheistic drive for the Israelites really started in the Second Temple period, which is after the exile. Okay, so just to give you that little bit of perspective, we are dealing with a time in which polytheism was the absolute norm, even in Israel. Okay, so that's the first theme. Yahweh and Yahweh alone is worthy of Israel's worship. Now there's a second theme, which is not such an obvious theme, but as becomes more and more obvious, has become more and more obvious to scholars as they started exploring this. Just in the Exodus story, that all pin back to, or could all refer back to, the Genesis account and the Noah's account. In other words, to put it in a nutshell, Genesis is about God being Israel's creator, but Exodus is about God being Israel's savior or their deliverer. But specifically, this act of deliverance or of saving is done in the metaphoric language of creation. In other words, when God comes to save, he comes to recreate, start anew. And this is something we're going to pick up on hard in probably a session or two from now, to have a look at the plagues, have a look at the Red Sea incident. Many of these, if you read them nicely, you get the ideas of recreation, the idea of chaos and order, of water and spirit, and darkness and dry land, and a collapse of water for destruction and a separation of water for deliverance. These are themes that really come from Genesis 1 and the Noah recreation account. And we're going to be picking up on that really, really hard. This theme has a lot of moving parts, and it takes a bit of time to get your head around it. But basically, it is saying that when God saves, he recreates. This doesn't seem to be such a strange idea to ancient people. Even in the New Testament, we have the likes of Paul, for instance, that in, I think it's Second Corinthians 15 or first, yeah, 2 Corinthians 5, 17, speaks about he who is in Christ, which means he who has been saved, or has access to salvation, is a new creation. Um, so even in the likes of Paul, a Pharisee of the first century AD, we still have this idea going, that when God comes to save, he is kind of in a recreating mood. Um, and so it would not surprise me that Paul got this idea exactly from the Old Testament, where it is used so much in the Psalms. But we will make our contact with it here in Exodus. And probably this is where Paul got this type of idea from. So we were spending quite a bit of time on this because it's one of the keys to understanding the language in which Exodus is written, to understanding the embellishment around the historical route. How do we know it's an embellishment? One of the ways we know is it's using literary devices such as creation and recreation motives in the describing of how God delivers these people. Okay. Other parts of the New Testament does the same thing. I think of Second Peter 3, and I think, yeah, that's the only one I think of right now. So God's act of salvation is tied with his act of creation, and that is a huge deal in Exodus, and we'll be spending quite a bit of time on that. The third major motive in this book is the idea of God's holy mountain. Now, it is the furthest thing, I guess, from the mind of a modern Christian, and I guess I say this because I'm one, I've been one for a very long time. The idea that God would have lived on this mountain, to me, is kind of ridiculous, because the way my perspectives on God is a little bit larger than the Zeus of Olympus. But it stands to reason that from the way we simply read Exodus, Moses meets this God on this mountain. And in order for the people to meet this God again, they got to get back to this mountain where he exposes himself to the people and gives them instructions. Um, so this mountain is incredibly important. We'll be spending a bit of time on this mountain because there's a bit of, I wouldn't call it controversy at all, but the mountain is sometimes called Horeb and sometimes called Sinai. And its location is also quite confusing, um, trying to tie Exodus, or the idea that Sinai is at the bottom of the Sinai Peninsula, doesn't tie up very well with Paul's idea of where the Mount Sinai is. And so we'll be spending a bit of time on that. But the fact that it's been called Horeb and Sinai, which is strange that one author would name the mountain two things without clarifying his double naming, uh, seems to suggest that we are, in some portions, dealing with two different traditions about this mountain and what it was actually called. But anyway, God gets them out of slavery, out of Egyptian slavery, and the reason is they can get them at this mountain, because that's kind of where they have to worship and sacrifice. That's the reason that Moses and Aaron brings to Pharaoh, initially at least. But it's here at Sinai where Moses receives the commands of God for governing Israel, governing their everyday life, and where they have to worship. Now, you know, it doesn't go that well. Um, this bunch of slaves basically starts a new religion right on the at the foot of this mountain, and that's just the beginning of it. But yeah, this is a major theme in the book of Exodus. Is there's a mountain, a place where the ground is holy, where you dare not look at, and there's thunderings, and it's a mythical place where God kind of lives and manifests himself in weird ways, like a burning bush. And from there, he gives his law to these people. Um, all right, and then let me just add this, because the question in your mind might be, but why would they then ever leave this mountain if God actually lives there? Well, that's where the tabernacle comes in, because the tabernacle basically becomes like a mobile Sinai, where the presence of God moves with the Israelites, um, as they move. This tent basically moves with them, and God becomes this pillar of smoke and pillar of fire that moves with them, moves into the promised land, and eventually ends up being a temple built by Solomon. So God kind of relocates then in some fashion. All right. The fourth theme, of course, is one we've mentioned much, but it is the idea of God's commands that come in Exodus. A people who initially, through Abraham, as they understand themselves, basically come from a Mesopotamian, Babylonian polytheism, now have to adjust, and they are called into a monotheism that lives and serves this one single God only, and he has different standards. Of course, we'll find out that a lot of the commands in the law seem to be very natural commands that would preserve life. Some of them overlap quite well with other ancient commands in other ancient Mesopotamian laws. For instance, the idea of eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth um, is not something that's new in by the time Moses writes it down. Excuse me. It's something that we know from Babylonian times already. But this is incredibly important, and it's the disobedience to these commands exactly that ends them in real trouble with Yahweh. Finally, something that seems quite clear, uh, the final, or the fifth, and there might be more, but we'll stop here. Fifth major theme of Exodus is the murmuring, the grumbling, and the rebellion of the Israeli people. The writer, it seems to be incredibly important for the writer to show that Israel is always pulling to the side, always pulling against God's instructions. Um, Maybe it's too early to add this here, but if we do think of when this was actually written down and the context for the ancient Israelites, who is basically Babylonian exile, maybe this is to serve as an example or a warning to them that this is in their blood and they need to repent from it, because otherwise the consequences will always be dire for them. Anyway, all right. So each time we think that God is no longer going to put up with the Israelites, they somehow make it through. Like, God literally wants to kill them a couple of times. There's one particular incident in which God wants to destroy the bunch of them, and Moses has to plead with God and basically change God's mind, um, so that he wouldn't kill them. And this is the way that God is portrayed in Genesis, Exodus, and this is stick with those two. Um, Specifically after Genesis 1, is in a very human way. He changes his mind, he regrets, he is sorry, he does things, he has to go to plan B. He often bursts out violently. He kills people left, right, and center. This is just the way that the Exodus, or that the Israelites in their time of writing understood God to be like. And this is something we can come up against often in Exodus, and it's, if you take time to absorb what is actually going on, it's a little bit disturbing, but it does fit the context really well. That people of that time understood their gods to be tribal, ancient warrior kings, basically, and specifically the Israelites had this view of God as a warrior who has a bow and a sword and defeats his enemies. It's not nothing new. The what we know from Ugaritic literature that comes from more or less in the land of Canaan, a little bit up, where we suspect the Israelites come from, they have things very, very similar. They understand their gods in this way, and one of the main purposes of gods in that time was to help people get the victory in warfare. And so to have a fearsome God and portray him in this way, um, was pretty normal. So we shouldn't be surprised by that. We should kind of expect it. The question is, what do we do with it? And I think we'll get to some answers on that as we move further along. All right, so those are the 5 themes. Let me just mention them again. Yahweh alone is worthy of worship. God comes to save, and it looks like an act of recreation. God's holy mountain, God's law or his commands, and then the grumbling and the rebelling of the Israelites. The other thing we need to quickly bounce onto before we start the actual chronological narrative is the staying power of the story of Exodus. Now, maybe I'm preaching to the choir here, but I tend to think that modern Christians forget the impact of the story of Exodus on the rest of the Bible. Not only forward in time, like for instance to a time like the time of the Maccabees, but also the impact that this historical memory, however which way it was embellished, has on the rewriting and the shaping of stories that were set in earlier times. For instance, the story or the account of Abraham. It seems like the Exodus account even influences the way in which that story is told. And we'll have a look at some examples. But really, Exodus pops up all over the Bible. I think before I jump too far ahead, let's have a look at some of these examples, just to show the importance of this story. One example stands out is, as I've mentioned, the call of Abraham. In Genesis 12, God promises, of course, Abraham to give him land and a nation, land of Canaan. Abraham and Sarah then find themselves now, listen carefully, they find themselves in a famine. Because of the famine, Abraham and Sarah and everybody with them move into Egypt. And what happens in Egypt? Of course, Abraham has to tell a half truth about who his wife is, and the wife Sarah ends up with Pharaoh. He's basically giving up on his dream, because Sarah is supposed to be the one that brings the son of promise. But anyway, guess what happens? God starts plaguing Pharaoh's household. I think it was diseases in this case, because of the presence of Sarah, until Pharaoh can't handle it anymore, and then basically kicks Abraham and Sarah out. And Abraham leaves with a lot of loot. Now, you might have noticed that that's the Exodus story, just in mini format. The Israelites move into Egypt because of famine in the time of Jacob. Pharaoh's household is plagued because they are kept as slaves against Yahweh as well. Eventually, because of the plagues, they are kicked out, and they come out with a lot of loot. Um, that's the same story. And so most scholars, as far as I understand this as actually the Exodus historical narrative, the historical, excuse me, the historical memory that is shaping the story of Abram. In other words, the story of Abram doesn't come first. The Exodus story in the minds of the ancient Israelites, that's the literal interpretation, and the story around Abraham and Sarah going to Egypt because of famine and coming out with loot because of plagues, bit of interruption there. So the father of the Israelites has his own little mini Exodus experience. And the strangeness of that is that the Exodus story is not written as an expansion of the Abraham story, but rather that the Abraham account is written in light of the Exodus story. That's how powerful the Exodus story was to the Israelites. And this is something we need to take note of. Just because it appears earlier in the Bible doesn't mean that it was written earlier or that it happened earlier. Things are a little bit more complicated than that. The point is that the Exodus story is used as a lens to evaluate everything in Israelite life, history, politics, economy, um, even into institutions and religious ceremonies. For example, 1 Samuel 8, the Israelites, they start asking for a king like everyone else, but it annoys Samuel and God, right? So God grants the wish, but it comes with a warning. The king will become like Pharaoh. Bam! And connecting this back to where they come from. He will enslave people, the warning says. And when that day comes, you will call out to God, and He will not answer you, and He won't save you again. Wow, okay, that's rather hectic. Um, when the Israelites forget the lessons of the Exodus, and they then go ahead and establish their own monarchy, things go really, really wrong, and they end up in Babylonian exile. Also later in Isaiah 63:11-13, the eventual release from the Babylonian exile is described as a second Exodus. Interesting. The later events are shaped by the Exodus story. The ancient story shapes how the newer ones are told. Now, if you are a Christian, the New Testament is also permeated with the Exodus story. In fact, you might even understand your own salvation in terms of the Exodus story. What does that mean? Well, God is angry and is about to judge slash kill all of humanity because they have sinned. But if you put the Passover lamb's blood on your doorpost, in other words, if you take and accept the saving sacrifice of Jesus, then you will be passed over and you won't be judged and you won't be killed. And I guess this is where a lot of Christians got into the habit of praying the blood of Jesus over things and smearing the blood of Jesus over things, which is really, well, there's no New Testament grounding really for that. It really comes from Exodus, that somehow we superstitiously believe that if we plead Jesus' blood over stuff, somehow we're going to have a better result. That comes directly from the Exodus narrative. So, but just jumping a little bit back from that idea, if you've ever studied the Gospel of Matthew, you'll realize that Matthew's birth narrative is also based on the Exodus story. He pictures Jesus and describes and writes about Jesus in specifically the birth narrative up unto the Sermon on the Mount in terms of the Exodus story. Here, Jesus, I'm not going to mention or compare the two. I'm just going to mention Jesus' life from a more neutral perspective. He is being searched for to be killed by a terrible king who wants to kill all the babies, Jesus, right? He escapes and he is called out from Egypt. He goes into the wilderness for 40 days. He comes out, he gets baptized, he goes through baptism. Paul equates that to the Red Sea experience. And then he goes into the wilderness for 40 days. Whoa, coincidence? Not at all. 40 days. like the Israelites, 40 years in the wilderness. Then after that, he goes to a mountain and he gives the Sermon on the Mount, and he gives to the people the law of God reinterpreted, or however you understand it. The point is simply that scholars have known for a long time that Matthew's account, number one, is very unique and is not found in the other Gospels. But only that, it is shaped around Jesus as the new Moses. The point being that this Moses Exodus wilderness Red Sea episode even shapes the way people would later write the birth and early chronological narrative about Jesus' life. The point is that Exodus has real legs, right? Paul later ties the baptism to the Israelites passing through the Red Sea. Never really lets go of these ideas. Jesus in the book of Hebrew is also compared to the new Moses. All right. So, the Passover meal, of course, in the Last Supper is refocused and becomes a symbol of the death of Jesus, the Lamb of God. The physical exodus from Egypt is reimagined as a spiritual exodus from sin in the New Testament into a life of freedom. And the reality is, we could go on and on. The Exodus story, and I end with this, the Exodus story is a big deal. It provides the backdrop for many of the key moments and the key theological ideas, not only of the Old Testament, but also of the New Testament, which shapes Christianity. Now, next week, we must start with tackling the story in a chronological fashion. We're going to start in Exodus 1 and work our way through the book in that way. Thank you so much for being with me today. I hope you have a wonderful week and enjoy the rest of your Sunday. Cheers.